Today is the day of reckoning. We are getting closer to Christmas. We have to look back at the year, what happened, what we did, what we achieved. And what we are looking at precisely is what were we thinking before Shadowlands was released about all the specs? What were the predictions? What were the calls? All the days and weeks you have spent watching videos and reading articles about rankings, about tier lists, about power levels, and about ratings of all the specs. Trying to choose your main. Is this main going to be viable? Is this spec going to be good? Am I going to be benched? Am I going to be refused from all the groups in Mythic Plus? I bet yes. I think no. Maybe, perhaps. So now we look at what happened to all those predictions. We look at all the right ones. We look at all the wrong ones. We make some amends for our mistakes. And we also gloat and be very smug at all the calls we got correctly. So from my side, from my part, I made a series of videos regarding the calls, the gutsy, feely crafty calls for Shadowlands. This was before Shadowlands was released. It is at this point basically a month ago for DPS, melee and range, and then tanks and healers. Now, what predictions did you have about certain specs? When it comes to DPS, when it comes to what DPS were doing in the beta and what was expected of them in Shadowlands, the easiest one to go for were Marksmanship Hunter, Affliction Warlock, and Shadow Priest. Those were the three specs that had been performing the best, most consistently throughout the entire beta. The only spec that was amongst them for a long time, but eventually ended up dropping because they got chain nerfed multiple times, was Frost Mage. Frost Mage was also performing very well, but through a series of nerfs to their talents, the legendaries, and their Ice Lance damage, they went a little bit, out of focus. So these specs were pretty easy and simple predictions. I think most of you might have considered them good already, especially Marksmanship. It's not that because Marksmanship was very poor throughout all of BFA and Beast Mastery took all the spotlight, people are surprised now that Marksmanship is good. It's not something that happened all of a sudden. It was already a thing, it was predicted. So these picks were very easy and they were very simple. Even when we look at the bottom, when we look at basically the opposite, the specs that were having the most trouble in the beta, you had the warrior specs, you had demonology, you had assassination, you had beast mastery hunter as opposed to marksmanship hunter, and you had the rework, the loss of borrowed power state of havoc demon hunter. Those were all also rather in line with how they are performing now in Shadowlands. There has not been many surprises there, right? Or did any of you actually think, no guys, you're all wrong, actually BM Hunter is going to be better than Marksmanship? Or were you thinking that Demonology Warlock was being slept on and it would have been better than Affliction? Give me your reasoning, otherwise you're going to be sent to a psych ward for further testing about your current mental state. Now, about the more middling specs, the specs harder to gauge, harder to predict. Specs like Elemental Shaman, Enhancement Shaman, Retribution Paladin, Windwalker Monk, all those specs that were considered to be in the middle. Well, they kind of still are, right? Is anyone surprised about their current situation, about how they are performing now compared to the beta? In my predictions, I thought Retribution Paladin was becoming better than in BFA because they were given a second burst window, essentially. Thanks to a series of 1-minute cooldowns that could now alternate their huge wings, their huge Avenging Wrath window with a shorter, smaller 1-minute window, which would have been very good in Mythic Plus, because now you have more pulls, more AoE packs you can be effective at with multiple cooldowns. It would have been more effective in raids because now you can target specific priority enemies better and more efficiently with multiple cooldowns, and it is performing, well. Retribution Paladin right now is in line to be amongst the better performing mini-specs, right below, of course, Unholy. Same can be said for Enhancement, although probably even more. If you remember, if you have good memory, in my melee DPS prediction, I actually did make a point for Enhancement. I mentioned that Enhancement has always been pretty low on community perception, pretty, ignored on the down low on that end. So my thought was that even if Enhancement was performing well and nicely, they would still have been somewhat ignored by the community because, it's Enhancement. It's not very popular. It's kind of meh, And right now it's kind of like this. Enhancement is actually on the same level of Red Paladin when it comes to performance, but for example, in terms of popularity, Retribution is still more popular than Enhancement, twice as much in Mythic Plus and almost 3 times as much in raids. Now, for some gloating on my side, for some smug celebration about being right in my predictions, I mentioned that the good old boomers would have still played BM Hunter even though Marksmanship would have been clearly better, and this is exactly what happened. Remember my points about cannibalism. Specs of the same class are going to be cannibalized by the spec that's doing the best. For example, Affliction is played almost 20 times more than Demonology. It's played over 6 times more than Destruction. You have Fire Mage that in raids is being played 6 times more than Arcane. And then of course you have Unholy that's played 10 more times than Frost. These type of numbers are not the same when it comes to BM and Marksmanship. BM is still rather popular, it's still at 4 to 5 times less than Marksmanship, but remains very popular despite Marksmanship being so much more effective. A similar call can be said for Rogue. I mentioned one of the specific calls I made is that even though Subtlety would have become pretty good, yes, after these calls, Subtlety actually got a bunch more nerfs to their conduits, but even then, my point was that Subtlety was pretty different to play than Outlaw and Assassination. Outlaw and Assassination are very straightforward, very simple, not much to look at when it comes to your cooldowns, your buffs, your debuffs. It's rather straightforward, whereas Subtlety is much more refined. It doesn't require as much finesse as the previous couple of expansions, but it is still more complicated and just different to play. So for that reason, I thought even if Outlaw was becoming less, powerful compared to Subtlety, even if Assassination was dropping greatly compared to Subtlety, Subtlety would still not have dominated the play rate, dominated the rogue spec. And it is kind of happening like this. Outlaw and Subtlety are still both played a lot. They are not really, eating each other out. They are still pretty evenly split in Mythic Plus and raids. So that was a nice, correct call. But now we have to look at the couple of wrong calls, because we have to make amends for the mistakes. The couple of wrong calls are about Unholy Death Knight, first of all, and then Fire Mage. So, in my defense, after my predictions, Fire Mage was buffed, or rather, some of its nerfs were reverted, particularly the ones around their legendaries and their conduits. They have gotten better because of this, as a result. But, for Unholy, not much of an excuse. Unholy is just performing much better than every other melee DPS spec. Their damage profile is way too strong. As I said, Blizzard already nerfed them. 20% effectiveness nerf to their mastery, which is not really going to do much. They're still going to continue being way too strong and require further nerfs. Despite all the DKs now coming here being triggered about leaving them alone, you guys have no shame. Their problem remains the fact that their damage can be used for everything. Be it single target cleave, 5 targets, 10 targets, they have it for everything, so in my initial ratings, I put them in around A tier and then Frost above them. The idea was that pack groups, uncoordinated groups, and just randoms would have been better with the Frost DK because it requires a little bit less setup in its cooldown and in the way it does damage, whereas Unholy DK requires a little bit more planning, a little bit more careful thinking on when to use your cooldowns compared to Frost, so it would have suffered a little bit more in pugs. Turns out it's not really the case. Unholy is still just performing just fine, even in pugs, so in both Mythic Plus and in raids, it has remained a very well-performing spec, outdoing the expectations so far. So that was definitely a botched one. As for Fire, they are doing much better than previously thought. Yes, they have gotten a series of buffs, but my call was that Frost would have been still good in Mythic Plus, and Fire would have been a little bit better when it came to single target situations as well as burst situation, and then the actual wrong call was Arcane. The call that Arcane would have crept up the ranks and become very powerful in raids, given certain encounters that required burst. Think about the extra damage phase on Sludge Fist, the burst required on the shield of the Shade of Keltast, the burst on the adds spawning on Council of Blood, bursting down the adds during the second phase of the Natrius. There were plenty of phases where an Arcane Mage would have done well, but it turns out the burst of a Fire Mage is just enough, and then Fire Mage is more complete in other areas of their damage compared to Arcane. And despite the buffs to Arcane, to their mobility, Fire is still the king of mobility, thanks to their execute phase always cast on the move Scorch, which makes them very, very fluid in their DPS uptake in the last phases of an encounter. So that was definitely a surprising one. It is still pretty scary to see Fire so effective early on in the expansion because Fire scales very well. So doing this much damage or being this effective this early on, it might be a little bit of a problem. The other surprise in this list, not really a wrong call because I didn't actually call much of anything for Balanced Druid, because their strength was single target, and in Mythic Plus, with their Starfall, there were other specs with stronger burst, more effective AoE burst that would have basically not made Starfall as effective in Mythic Plus, but now they are performing even better. They have gotten a slight buff to their Starlord talent and their Soul of the Forest talent after these predictions, as well as a buff, I guess a further buff, to their Eclipse, but still, the way they are performing now is definitely off the charts. I wonder how many people thought that balance was going to be this effective, particularly in raids, specifically in single target encounters where they can basically guarantee their Convoke the Spirits to get full effectiveness on the target they want. Now, when we look at the probably easiest one to make predictions of, we're looking at tanks. So before Shadowlands was released, there were these school of thoughts. Protection Paladin and Vengeance Demon Hunter were doing a ton of damage in Mythic Plus, and they would have been the two-go tanks for Mythic Plus. And then you had Raiding. Raiding, you wanted to be defensive, you wanted to be safe, you wanted to be staying alive as long as possible, because that's what matters when you progress. So Brewmaster Monk being the most defensive, Blood Death Knight being the most self-sufficient, as well as the creeping up, thanks to my shilling, obviously, the creeping up Guardian Druid after a series of defensive buffs. So not much has changed in these predictions. The Protection Warrior was still, languishing at the bottom. Vengeance Demon Hunter became even more popular in the Mythic Plus scene simply because basically Protection Paladin got nerfed more and more in terms of its damage. So Vengeance remained alone at the top when it came to damage. Even after these nerfs, by the way, even after all the nerfs to Prot, as of right now, in high keys, Vengeance Demon Hunter has 29% representation, while Prot Paladin has 23%. The second best by quite a big margin, so they are still pretty popular. It's just that their damage nerfs have solidified Vengeance Demon Hunter as the better tank for now, with Protection Warrior as the least used. And then in the middle you have a pretty balanced mix of Blood, Brewmaster and Guardian. When it comes to raids, the popularity is more on the side of Brewmaster and Blood Death Knight on the other hand, because of all this safety. And of course, again, not very surprisingly, Vengeance Demon Hunter was very, very unpopular in raids. This was not a hard call to make, that Vengeance Demon Hunter would have been very good in Mythic Plus and poor in raids. It has been confirmed so far. Same for Protection Warrior, not really popular anywhere. So tanks were actually not that difficult to make calls of. The last of the predictions was regarding healers. This is where I have to pull out my huge, throbbing, pulsating dick, because my call about healers was that Throughput was going to make a comeback, was that the Holy Trinity of Devotion Aura, Spirit Link Totem, and Barrier would have lost value. The example I made, to make you understand, to make people who don't raid understand, the previous years of raiding went like this. Phases of 4 out of 10 damage, and then spikes of 10 out of 10 damage. To survive this 10 out of 10 spike, you need damage reduction. You need Barrier, you need Devotion Aura, you need Spirit Link Totem, and that's why these specs, Discipline, Restoration Shaman, and Holy Paladin were so popular. The prediction was that the way the damage looked in Castornatria wasn't a 4 out of 10 phase and a few 10 out of 10 phases. It was more like a consistent 7 out of 10 throughout the entire encounter and a few maybe 8 out of 10 spikes of damage. So very, very strong, short damage reduction cooldowns were losing a lot of value to straight up strong HPS, strong throughput, strong consistent healing. What does this mean? It means the specs that don't have strong and consistent healing, like Discipline Priest, like Holy Paladin, were going to lose value in raids, and specs with very good throughput, very good HPS would have gained value. Now, the specs that have had the highest HPS throughout probably several expansions were Resto Druids and Holy Priests. This has always been a borderline meme in the raiding scene about Holy Priests being technically the strongest healers for several expansions because of their HPS, because of how much they can heal. There's a problem. They have got fuck all in everything else. Their cooldowns are awful, their tank cooldown is a joke, their raid cooldowns are terrible, they have shit mobility, they have terrible defensives of themselves, so very poor. However, in these encounters in Castornatria, throughput is very important, which is going to make Holy Priest much better. We have entered a bizarro world. The bizarro world where Holy Priest is now fighting amongst the better and more popular healer specs for raids. In several fights, Discipline Priests are basically being benched, or rather, they are basically being forced to respec to Holy just because they have to cut several HPS checks. Good Discipline Priests are still relevant, still very powerful. It's just that now you do have the option for Holy. You do have the option for very high throughput. Sometimes, for example, on Hungering Destroyer, where the boss is going to heal based on the damage it's going to do, Discipline Priest becomes incredibly powerful. Because you can Spirit Shell, you can absorb the damage so the boss doesn't heal. Not only can you prevent damage, but you can also prevent healing. effectively, on the Hungering Destroyer fight, no joke, a Disciplined Priest will be top damage because of all the healing from the boss they prevented. And then there are other fights where healing a ton is very important and Holy is gonna gain value. So there was a very interesting turn of events that happened between the beta and Shadowlands. Of course, in Mythic Plus, the prediction was Restore Shaman and Restore Druid. I take full credit for this. I was talking up Restoration Shaman in Mythic Plus being very powerful back when many people were shitting on Restoration Shaman and laughing at it, pointing out how bad it was, and then all of a sudden they started mentioning how it was super strong. But that's too late, man. It's too late to take credit. Of course, the reservations to Restore Shaman are the same I made when it comes to Vengeance Demon Hunter multiple times. The reservation for Vengeance are about, right now, Vengeance is doing fine because they can heal back up the damage they take, but what's gonna happen when you go higher in keys? When the damage the enemies do to you is going to scale harder than the damage you can do as a tank to heal yourself back up. That's what happened in BFA, and that's when Vengeance Demon Hunter lost a lot in popularity. Now though, there is a slightly better outlook on the future for Vengeance. They have been buffed in a few scaling stats, but more importantly, they have the option to become much more defensive with the Fiery Brand build, but they would be losing their damage. So it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen at higher keys with the damage intake of Vengeance. Similar for Restoration Shaman. Restoration Shaman is getting by now because at these level of keys, you don't need damage reduction cooldowns. You don't need very strong externals. You can get by with very powerful heals, which is what Shaman has. What's going to happen at higher keys when Shaman's hard casting a heal is not going to be enough to keep a tank up? He will start having to look for damage reduction, which Shaman doesn't have. The only, reasonable pseudo damage reduction they can use is Spirit Link, which is a party raid utility and not as strong when used on a tank. It's no Life Cocoon, it's no Pain Suppression, it's no Iron Bark, so we're going to have to see there what happens at higher keys, 22, 23, 24, 25, if the Restore Shaman healing is still going to be enough. Out of all the healer calls, I have to make amends for the wrong call about Mistweaver Monk. I thought amongst the very good scaling, HPS and throughput raid healers, Mistweaver would have been one of them. I mentioned Holy Priest and Resto Druid, but I also mentioned Mistweaver. Instead, Mistweaver is not very popular. I also mentioned after the buffs, yes, the legendary was nerfed after a while, but it would have still been a better build for Mythic Plus compared to BFA, and in Mythic Plus as well, Mistweaver Monk hasn't really picked up a lot. They have remained the least popular spec in Mythic Plus. They are the least popular spec of Heroic Raiding. They are the least popular spec of Mythic Raiding, and they are the least popular spec in Mythic Plus. So all around, right now, Mistweaver is the least popular. So that was a wrong call. I thought they would have gotten past Holy Paladin and Discipline Priest and started fighting with Holy Priest and Restoration Druid and Shamans as well, but no, it did not happen. Mistweaver Monk did not rise up. So at the end of the day, tell me guys, which one of the calls have surprised you the most? What really you weren't expecting at all? In terms of damage, in terms of healing, in terms of tanking, if you have been caught off guard by certain specs being there and you're like, who let you in here? Why are you here? My biggest surprise out of all these changes have been the fall of Arcane Mage. I actually put a lot of stock in Arcane Mage damage, and it doesn't seem like it's working as much. Yes, technically, if you look at the mythic logs, currently Arcane Mage has the highest damage done of all the specs, but then again, there is like 70 logs, which isn't very reliable. A similar thing can be said about Feral. Once again, no, I have not forgotten Feral. Feral is actually doing very well in raids. The problem is that there is such few logs that it's very difficult to gauge them correctly. When there is 100 logs of Feral and like 3,000 for marksmanship and 1,600 for Shadow Priest, how can you gauge 100 logs effectively? Same goes for Heroic, between 15 and 20 times less represented than all the higher popular specs. So it's a little bit tough to sort of give a rating to Feral, although they're still doing, much better than expected. Even if we count the shakiness of the logs, they're definitely doing just fine. It's just, once again, a case of community perception. Even if, theoretically speaking, Feral Druid is out-damaging an Outlaw Rogue and a Subtlety Rogue, when you look for a raid, people are gonna look for Sub-Rogues and Outlaw Rogues and not Feral. It's just as simple as that. So with this, we can take a break and see each other tomorrow. Point out your most 600 IQ Galaxy Brain calls and predictions regarding all the specs and their performances so far that you have made, a few weeks ago, maybe even months ago. Remember always that I personally know your landlord, so if you don't subscribe, I will have a word with him and you will be evicted in a matter of days. So keep that in mind. Now, it's time to leave. So see you guys soon and In the meantime, I'm on the phone with him right now.